She had been living with a dead man for 11 months. She didn't know it. No one did. Not the neighbors who waved at her from across the street each morning. Not her co-workers who ate lunch with her 3 times a week. Not even the detective who had already closed the case. The dead man had a name. He had a face. And for almost a year, he had been watching her from inside the walls of her own home, eating her food, reading her mail, sleeping just 6 feet away from her while she slept. And the most terrifying part? She had already met him. She just didn't remember. My name isn't important. What matters is that I spent 8 months retracing every single step of this story. The police reports, the interview transcripts, the neighbor testimonies, the psychiatric evaluations, and what I found was not just strange. It was the kind of thing that makes you look at your own house differently. Makes you wonder what's in your walls. This is the story of Miriam Osei and the man who never left. In the spring of 2014, Miriam Osei was 31 years old, and she was done. Done with her ex-husband, done with the apartment they had shared in South Atlanta for 4 years, done with the sound of the arguments that had soaked into those walls like cigarette smoke. She wanted out. And when a property listing showed up in her email, a 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, she read it on her lunch break, called the landlord by dinner time, and signed the lease by the following Friday. That was November 4th, 2014. The house was old, not charming old, not vintage old, just old. The kind of old where the stairs creak on the 3rd step, where the hot water takes 40 seconds to arrive, where there's a smell in the basement that you can only describe as the past. The landlord, a soft-spoken man named Dale Whitmore, had owned the property since the late 90s and had rented it to a rotating cast of short-term tenants. The last tenant, Dale told her, had moved out in August. The house had been empty for about 3 months. Miriam didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. Empty felt like peace. Empty felt like hers. She spent the first weekend painting the kitchen yellow, sleeping on an air mattress in the master bedroom, and eating takeout straight from the container while watching home renovation videos on her laptop. It was, by her own account, one of the most contented weekends of her adult life. She had no idea she wasn't alone. The first sign came on a Tuesday, November 11th to be exact, exactly 1 week after she moved in. Miriam came home from work at around 6:30 in the evening, dropped her bag by the door, went to the bathroom, and when she came out, she noticed something that stopped her cold. Her kitchen cabinet, the one directly above the stove, was open. Now here's the thing. Miriam was meticulous. She was the kind of person who color-coded her calendar, who made her bed the moment she got out of it, who always closed cabinet doors. She stood there in the kitchen for a moment, staring at this open cabinet, running through every possible explanation her brain could offer. She must have left it open that morning. She closed it, made dinner, forgot about it. But the next morning, before she left for work, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the cabinet again. Closed. Fine. She nodded to herself and left. And when she came home that evening, the cabinet was open again. This time she didn't close it immediately. This time she called her friend Yolanda, who she'd known since college, and told her about the cabinet. Yolanda laughed. "Girl, you probably sleepwalking." "I don't sleepwalk. Then it's drafts. Old house. You said the windows are drafty. The cabinet opens from a hinge. Drafts don't do that." There was a pause on the line. Then Yolanda said, "Okay, well, maybe it's the ghost of your marriage coming to haunt you." Miriam laughed. She didn't think it was funny for long. Over the next 3 weeks, the incidents multiplied. But here's what made them strange. They were never dramatic. They were never movie horror moments. They were small, subtle, the kind of thing that taken one at a time you'd dismiss. A dish moved on the counter, a book she didn't remember reading lying open on the couch, the thermostat set to a different temperature than she'd left it, the bath towel, the one hanging on the rod, positioned differently, backwards, like someone had used it and rehung it facing the wrong way. Every single time, Miriam found a logical explanation. She was tired. She was distracted. Moving into a new place was stressful. The brain plays tricks when you're adjusting to a new environment. She had a therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Adeze Nwosu, who she'd been seeing since the divorce, and she mentioned these incidents in their Tuesday sessions. "It sounds like your mind is looking for patterns," Dr. Nozu told her. That's not unusual for someone in transition. The need to feel that your environment is unpredictable can actually be a symptom of control anxiety. Are you sleeping well? Miriam said she was fine. She wasn't sleeping fine, because the sounds started in December. It began as something she could barely hear. A soft sound, rhythmic, low, that she'd catch sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning. It was coming from somewhere below her. From the basement. She couldn't describe it precisely. The closest she could get was that it sounded like pages turning, like someone reading a book, very quietly, in the dark. The first time she heard it, she sat up in bed and listened for 11 minutes. Then it stopped. She convinced herself it was the furnace. The second time, 3 nights later, she got out of bed, padded down to the basement door, and stood there with her hand on the doorknob for what felt like a very long time. Then the sound stopped. She went back to bed. The third time she called the police. The officer who came was a young woman named Caldwell, maybe 26, calm, professional, with the kind of practiced neutrality you develop after responding to enough noise complaints. She searched the basement while Miriam stood at the top of the stairs. She was down there for about 4 minutes. "There's nothing down there, ma'am," Officer Caldwell told her when she came back up. "Old furnace, some boxes you haven't unpacked, no signs of entry." "I know what I heard," Miriam said. "I believe you. Old houses make sounds. The pipework down there is old, the furnace cycles at night. It can sound like almost anything. If it happens again, call us." She left. Miriam stood in the kitchen for a while after that, staring at the basement door. Nothing happened for 9 days. Then everything happened. It was a Saturday, January 3rd, 2015. Miriam had been in the house for almost exactly 2 months. She woke up that morning, made herself coffee, and went to get her laptop from the side table next to the bed. The laptop wasn't there. She spent 15 minutes looking for it, checking the couch, the kitchen counter, the dining table. She even went back into the bedroom and checked under the bed. Nothing. Then she went downstairs to the small study on the first floor that she used occasionally, and the laptop was there, on the desk, open. And the browser, her browser, was on a page she didn't recognize. It was a real estate listing site. The page was open to a listing for a property in Valdosta, Georgia, about 3 hours away. Miriam stared at the screen for a very long time. She did not search for property in Valdosta. She had no reason to be in Valdosta. She didn't know anyone in Valdosta. She closed the browser. She sat down. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and took 4 deep breaths. Then she called Yolanda. "Yolanda, I need you to come over." "What? It's 8 in the morning." "I know. I need you to come over right now." Yolanda arrived by 10. Miriam walked her through the house, the cabinet, the thermostat, the towel, the moved objects, the sounds in the basement, the laptop. Yolanda listened to all of it while standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, the way she always stood when she was taking something seriously. When Miriam finished, Yolanda said, "You need to change your locks. The landlord gave me the only key. That doesn't mean it's the only key that exists." Neither of them wanted to say the next part out loud. They stood in the kitchen facing each other, and the space between the words was thick. Someone had a key, or someone didn't need one. Yolanda spent 3 hours helping Miriam go through the entire house. They checked every window, every latch, every lock, every screen. They checked the front door, the back door, the basement door. They checked the small side window in the bathroom that Miriam had never used. Everything was locked. "Now I need you to do something for me," Yolanda said before she left. "Get a camera, a cheap one of those motion detect plug-in ones. Put it in the kitchen, put one in the living room, and put one pointed at the basement door, because whatever is happening in here, let's find out what it is." Miriam ordered 3 cameras that evening. They arrived 2 days later. She installed them on Wednesday, January 7th. She tested them. They worked. She pointed the basement door camera so it had a clear line of sight down the hallway. She left for work Thursday morning. She came home Thursday evening. She checked the footage. And that was the moment everything changed. The footage from the kitchen camera showed nothing unusual. The footage from the living room showed nothing unusual. But the footage from the hallway camera, the one pointed at the basement door, showed something that made Miriam sit down on the floor. At 2:14 in the afternoon, while she was at work, the basement door opened. Not blew open, not swung open. It opened slowly, deliberately, the kind of way a door opens when someone is trying to be quiet. And a hand came out. Just a hand. It reached out and pulled the door almost shut again, leaving it open just a crack, then withdrew. That was all. The door stayed open, just slightly, for the rest of the day, until Miriam came home and found it the way it always was, closed. Miriam watched that 11-second clip 12 times before she could speak. Then she called 911. The responding officer this time was different. His name was Detective Ruben Ademoya, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead. He came with a partner, and they searched the basement with proper lights this time. They were down there for 22 minutes. When Ademoya came back up, he sat down at Miriam's kitchen table, took off his glasses and said, "When did you last fully open the basement? I've barely been down there. There's nothing I need down there. The previous tenant, do you know anything about them? The landlord said they moved out in August. I moved in November, 3 months gap." Ademoya wrote something in his notebook. "And this door at the back of the basement, the utility room door. Do you have a key for it?" Miriam felt the blood leave her face. "What door? What utility room?" Ademoya set his pen down. "Ms. Osei, there is a utility room in the basement that is locked from the inside. My partner is down there with it now. We're going to need to break it open." They broke it open. I want you to imagine what it must feel like to have been living in a house for 2 months, telling yourself every night that you were alone, that you were fine, that the sounds were the furnace and the open cabinets were your own distracted mind, and then to watch 2 police officers break down a door inside your own home. And behind it, to find a life. Not a body. Not something dead. A life. There was a cot, a sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, a plastic bin with canned food in it, beans, soup, tuna, crackers, a stack of paperback novels, a portable phone charger, a bucket in the corner with a lid on it that Ademoya told her to stay away from, a small mirror, a toothbrush, and pinned to the wall above the cot, like a decoration, like art, photographs. Photographs of Miriam, taken through windows, taken through the crack of a door, taken while she slept, taken while she cooked, taken while she sat on her couch reading. There were 47 of them. They had been there long enough to curl at the corners. Detective Ademoya's report would later confirm what the photographs suggested. Someone had been living in that utility room for months before Miriam ever moved in. The previous tenant, Dale Whitmore's last renter before Miriam, had left in August, but someone had stayed. The canned food, the books, the photographs, the bucket. A human being had been living in the sealed utility room in Miriam Osei's basement for at least 4 months, possibly longer. They had survived down there, and 3 times a week, roughly, they had come out, into her house, while she was at work, while she slept. And now that she had cameras, they had come out at 2:14 on a Thursday afternoon, reached into the hallway, seen something they didn't expect and retreated. What had they seen? Ademoya figured it out within an hour. The cameras. They'd spotted one of the cameras through the crack in the basement door, and they'd pulled back. "Why didn't they leave?" Miriam asked. Ademoya paused before he answered. "Because they thought they could still hide." That night, Miriam went to stay at Yolanda's house. She didn't go back to the Savannah house for 11 days. Detective Ademoya put plainclothes officers on the property, 2 rotating in 12-hour shifts, positioned to watch all entry and exit points, without being visible from the street. He did not publicize the investigation. He did not release information to neighbors. He told Miriam this was strategic. If whoever was living in that room had a routine, he wanted them to walk back into that routine. She asked him how long this might take. "As long as it takes," he said. It took 4 days. On the 5th day of the stakeout, January 13th, 2015, at 3:40 in the morning, a motion sensor in the driveway was triggered. Officer Priya Thambidurai was on duty inside a parked vehicle across the street, watching a monitor linked to the basement area camera. She saw a figure, slight, male, wearing dark clothing, emerge from a gap in the side fence she hadn't noticed before. He moved along the side of the house, lifted a loose basement window pane that she had not flagged as accessible in her briefing, and lowered himself inside. She radioed Ademoya. Ademoya was there within 6 minutes. By that time, a second officer had quietly sealed the basement window from outside. The man inside had no idea he'd been locked in. There were 4 officers in that basement when they opened the utility room door. Inside, crouched in the corner on his cot, was a 29-year-old man named Frederick Elam. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He sat with his knees drawn to his chest and looked at the officers with an expression that Ademoye would later describe in his official report as resigned. As if he had expected this moment. As if, on some level, he had been waiting for it. "I wasn't going to hurt her," Frederick said before they even asked him anything. What followed, the investigation, the trial, the psychiatric evaluations, took the better part of 2 years. But the picture that emerged was this. Frederick Elam had grown up in Macon, Georgia. He was the only child of a single mother who worked 2 jobs and was, by all accounts from neighbors who knew the family, a good woman trying hard in a difficult situation. Frederick had been a quiet kid, good with his hands. He'd spent 3 years doing light carpentry work for a local contractor after high school, which was where, police believed, he developed the ability to identify structural weaknesses in buildings, where the soft points were, where a space could be accessed that most people wouldn't think to look at. He had no violent criminal history. He had no history of violence at all. What he had was a psychiatric history, a long and complicated one, that had never been properly treated. The evaluating psychiatrist, Dr. Solomon Kari, would testify at length about what she found. Frederick, she said, suffered from a form of severe attachment disorder, combined with what she described as relational delusion, a condition where the patient forms an intense, imagined emotional bond with a person they have never actually met or have only briefly encountered. He didn't believe he was a threat, Dr. Kari testified. He believed he was a guardian. He believed the woman in the house wanted him there, that she needed his presence, even if she didn't know it consciously. Here's where the story goes somewhere unexpected. Because when detectives traced Frederick's movements backward, when they asked the question of why this house, why Miriam, they found an answer. 8 months before Miriam signed the lease, in March of 2014, Frederick had been working as a casual laborer for a cleanup crew. One of their jobs was clearing out a storage unit in Atlanta, an impersonal, routine job. They'd been hired by the ex-husband, Miriam's ex-husband. The storage unit contained furniture, boxes, and at the front, visible from the rolling door, a framed photograph of Miriam. Frederick had seen it. According to his own account, he had picked it up, looked at it for a long time, set it down, walked away. He described this moment in his psychiatric evaluation in a way that Dr. Kari said she had never forgotten. He said she looked like she was waiting for someone. That was March 2014. He found the Savannah house in October. He'd followed the ex-husband's social media, which mentioned the divorce, which led him to the address. He found the unlocked basement window. He found the utility room. He'd been in that utility room since late October 2014. He was there when the moving truck arrived. He was there when Miriam painted the kitchen yellow. He was there the first night she slept in the house. He had been there from the very beginning. Miriam gave one interview years later to a journalist who spent months earning her trust. The interview was published quietly. She wasn't looking for attention. She just wanted to, as she put it, say the thing out loud one time. The journalist asked her, was there any single moment, looking back, where she actually knew, even if she pushed it down? Miriam thought about it for a while. The towel, she said finally. One morning, maybe 3 weeks after I moved in, I had this white bath towel on the rack. It was facing the right way when I went to sleep. When I woke up, it was facing backward, like someone had used it and rehung it. The journalist asked, what did you tell yourself? I told myself I must have done it in the middle of the night, half asleep. A pause, but I remember standing in the bathroom for a moment, looking at that towel. And I had this feeling, not a thought, not a clear thought, just this feeling, like the house was full. Full. That was the word she used. Not full of danger, just full. Like there was more here than I could see. She moved to Edinburgh, Scotland 4 months after the trial. She works as a graphic designer. She lives on the 4th floor of an apartment building with no basement. She was asked once if she feared the house, if she feared being alone. She said, I don't fear the house. The house didn't do anything wrong. I fear the gap between what we think we know about our surroundings and what's actually there. I fear that gap. I think we all should, a little. Frederick Elam was convicted of criminal trespass and stalking in 2016. He was sentenced to 4 years in a secure psychiatric facility and 2 years probation. He never contacted Miriam again. The psychiatric reports from his time in the facility suggest he made genuine progress, that the delusion, with treatment, lost its grip. But there's one last thing, one thing that Detective Ademoye told me when I spoke to him, 2 years after everything had concluded. I asked him, what was the hardest part of this case? He leaned back in his chair. He's retired now. He took off his glasses, the same reading glasses he'd had since before the case, and turned them over in his hands. You know what gets me, he said, is not the strangeness of it. I've seen strange things in 30 years. You stop being surprised by people. What gets me is the routine. He meant Frederick's routine. Because when they went through the utility room, collecting evidence, cataloging everything, they found something else. Among the paperback novels and the lantern and the canned food, a journal. Frederick had kept a journal the entire time he was there. It wasn't rambling. It wasn't violent. It wasn't what you'd expect. It was, and this is what Ademoye said to me, and I've read excerpts from the trial record since, it was almost ordinary. He wrote about the weather, about which novels he was reading, about sounds he heard through the ceiling, the television, footsteps, the creak of the third step on the stairs. He wrote about the smell of coffee in the mornings. He wrote that the smell made the house feel lived in. He wrote, in one entry dated December 19, 2014, she laughed today. On the phone, I think, a real laugh, the kind that catches itself midway, like it surprised her. I hadn't heard that before. It was a good day. I've sat with that entry for a long time. I don't share it to make Frederick sympathetic. What he did was wrong. It was violating. It was a crime that cost Miriam her sense of safety in her own home, and that is a cost that doesn't get fully repaid just because no physical harm occurred. There are many forms of harm, but I share it because it's the truest possible illustration of what made this case so deeply strange. Not the horror of it, not the criminal of it, the ordinariness of it. This man had built a life, a small contained shadow life in the walls of another person's world. He had a routine, he had meals, he had books he was working through. And he listened to the sounds of a woman living upstairs and thought, this is enough for me. And Miriam, on the other side of the ceiling, painted her kitchen yellow and fell asleep to sounds she told herself were the furnace, and started to feel, slowly, for the first time in years, like herself again. 2 people. 6 feet of wood and concrete between them. 2 completely different stories happening at the same time in the same house. One of them knew it. One of them didn't. You know what Miriam said in that interview at the very end? The journalist asked if she had any final thought, anything she hadn't said yet. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, the thing about that year I spent in that house before I knew, I was actually happy. I was healing. I was painting walls yellow and watching movies and calling my friends and becoming myself again after a really hard few years. And he was down there, in the dark, listening. Another pause. I don't want to give that time back. I don't want to let what he did erase the fact that I was healing. I'm not going to do that. I'm keeping the yellow. Even here, in Edinburgh. I painted my kitchen yellow. She kept the yellow. This case never made major national news. It was a local story. A brief police report, a trial that concluded without fanfare. There are thousands of stories like this that vanish into archives, into filing cabinets, into the ordinary machinery of a world that is always generating more strangeness than it can process. But I keep coming back to Miriam. I keep coming back to the 11 seconds of footage, that hand reaching out from the basement door, slow, quiet, withdrawing. And I keep asking myself the question that I think this story is really asking. How well do we know the spaces we inhabit? How many times have we stood in our own kitchen, in our own home, a place we believe completely and without question that we are alone, and maybe, just maybe, we weren't? The answer for most of us is we were alone. We were fine. But most of us is not all of us. And somewhere, in some house, in some city, someone is standing in the bathroom, looking at a towel that's been turned the wrong way, and telling themselves they must have done it in the night. And they're probably right, but probably is not certainly. And that difference, that small, cold gap between probably and certainly, is where the strange, dark, and mysterious lives. It always has. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next day.